Dara lecht Australia fi Leochan Tourmakeady agus is mór an onardum lecht Ultan Lally a chore Osfor Gore Nacht. You're all very welcome to the second lecture in the Michael O'Brien lectures and commemoration of the Tourmakeady Ambush, and I'd like to welcome Ultan Lally to give this lecture.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, it doesn't bother boilum weeks a glachel Michael Hegarty, August Thomas, Maureen Joe Graney, August Sean Lydon, August, well, an over a fad, it's a gente akop, Mila weeks, Commemorative, as an Kira horse her show. Show yen or not. I better get this thing going. But just by means of a brief introduction, my usual period and area of research is the west of Ireland in the 17th century. Now, in a sense, comparative approaches to revolutionary periods can be tedious exercises at the best of times. But to place my early modernist cap on my head, one decade in particular in the 1600s might seem to stand out as a period of 10 years or so in this country, when the majority population seemed to be on the cusp of achieving a type of ownership in their own future affairs. Similarly, these slides aren't coming up at all, but similarly highlighting the decade or so from 1641 to 1653 in Ireland, with the decades of centenaries that mark the 10 or so years between 1912 and 1923, might be a bit tenuous. Nevertheless, 1641 to 1653 and 1912 to 1923 are each decades when the zeitgeist, or spirit and mood in Ireland, seems to have been one inexorably moving towards change. Now, at the risk of labouring the comparison, the earlier of the two decades begins with the 1641 rebellion. The subsequent years saw the Irish Catholic Confederacy coming into being. The Confederacy Wars illustrated a national cohesion falling apart, and the end of the 1640s marked the arrival of Cromwell and the decisive conquest of the country. Despite its downfall, though, as Jane Ollymore has pointed out, and I quote, even though Catholic Ireland failed to win lasting political autonomy within the context of a tripartite Stuart monarchy, its rebellion of the 1650s nevertheless ranks as one of the most successful revolts in early modern history. For between 1642 and 1649, the Confederation of Kilkenny enjoyed legislative independence and Irish Catholics worshipped freely. Now, of course, as we all know, the autonomy enjoyed during the Confederation years proved to be short-lived, and by the end of the decade, the fortunes of the indigenous Gaelic Irish and the Anglo-Norman population would receive a fatal blow from which many of this demographic would take centuries to recover. Irish historiography, approaching the centuries that follow the demise of the Irish Confederate cause, is often presented on a stage in which the majority population on this island played second fiddle to the country's minority. Things were not quite as simple or as straightforward as that, but for all intents and purposes, this is the framework in which both traditions on this island, by and large, historically like to see themselves as occupying. When approaching the Decade of Commemorations that marked the changes that took place at the start of the beginning of the 20th century, therefore, neither tradition on this island ought to be ignored in the discourse. The value of the Decade of Commemoration, which we are living through at the moment, and which organisations like Commemorative are part, have much to offer and on many levels. As the adage goes, if we don't know where we came from, it might seem very difficult to know where we might be going. Michael D. Higgins, in his own inimitable way, summed up the importance of one aspect of commemoration of this decade in terms of the discourse that it might induce. And I quote, "I suggested that we are all challenged to engage with our shared past in a manner that is honest, authentic, and inclusive. And that if commemoration is understood in this way, that it might assist in healing the wounds of conflicts, recognize different narratives as to their causes and their repercussions that cannot and should not be forgotten. The complex events we recall from a century ago are integral to the story that has shaped our peoples in all their diversity, and how they are recalled and understood will continue to shape us and the decisions we make into the future. Amnesia will not help us. I believe that we and those who are part of the discourse with us must remember in full, taking all of the diverse perspectives and experiences of what happened into account, with the willingness to hear the stories that might prove less comfortable and give space to perspectives that might challenge each other." End quote. But this presentation will be given from the perspective of the volunteers and Cumann and those that supported their endeavours in South Mayo. Other perspectives remain, however, crucial to the discourse. Now, it was about 7 years ago now, just after my late mother died, that my late father got itchy feet to traverse again the revolutionary period in South Mayo. And I have to admit that it proved a privilege to traverse those lanes and byways of the region with them. Mainly, it must be added, from the comfort of 2 armchairs in the front room at home, in the years that coincided with the last years of my father's life. The original book that was published in O'Toole's in 2008 was the beneficiary of the last of a remarkable generation of Mayo people that possessed vital insight into the generation that preceded them. I'm thinking here of Jay Moran of Kildun, Kathleen Dooley of Kilmaine, Martin Lally of Shongarth, John Casey of Partry, and a host of others who offered vital and valuable contributions. Now, until relatively late in the 20th century, concerning much of the secondary literature addressing the Tan War or War of Independence, many secondary accounts might be said to have approached the subject in an overly militaristic fashion. South Mayo is no different from the rest of Ireland in this respect. But one casualty resulting from this approach is the manner in which female perspectives on the events were too often sidelined to a nameless and voiceless periphery. With respect to the volunteers' comrades in Cumann, this is notably the case. The members that made up Cumann were not bit players, but central participants to what happened. Writing about the marginalised place of such women in much of the narrative addressing the revolutionary period, Dublin-based historian Liz Gillis puts it more eloquently when she writes, and I quote, "It is a story that has been relegated to the sidelines for too long. We owe it to those that lived through those times, to ourselves, to our future generations, to have the women's narrative where it belongs, beside that of their male counterparts." End quote. But this tendency to overlook and sideline women from the narrative is perhaps noticeable in Ernie O'Malley's account of the events surrounding May the 3rd, with respect to the nameless women who played such an integral part in saving Brigadier Tom Maguire's life in the days after the events of the ambush, when, I might add, the region was crawling with Tans, British soldiers and RIC. Had Ernie O'Malley gone to the bother of asking any household in Srah while he was writing his account of May the 3rd, they wouldn't have been long pointing out to him how so many of its female inhabitants, with reckless abandon for their own well-being and safety, selflessly helped carry and care for the injured brigadier while he remained in their area. Some of these women include Mary Heenahan, Mary Moynihan, Kate Costello, Julia Lally, Bridget Heenahan, Bridget Lydon, and Bridget Lally, as well, of course, as Judy and Julia Joyce. Now, the story of the Tan War in South Mayo is a story of men and women from townlands, villages, no less than the inhabitants of the larger towns of the district. Places like Kildun, Srah, Cross, Shongarth, Partry, the Valley, Ballinrobe, Ballyglass, Ball, Cong and Glenmask, as well as a plethora of other areas that made up a collective effort in attempting to effect change at the time. The contribution of a townland like Kildun, beside the nail is a fascinating one. The O'Brien family of Katie and her brothers Phelim and Michael, the Morans and the O'Hares, and Seamus Burke, the commandant of the Cross Battalion, all of whom were natives of Kildun, reflect a community that was to provide a significant contribution that was felt far beyond its own boundaries and indeed far beyond the revolutionary period. Professor Phelim O'Brien, for instance, has been heralded by Professor Eustace O'Haydon as being the father of adult education in Ireland. Michael O'Brien was said to converse with Srah volunteers in Irish. His brother Phelim conducted his philosophy lectures at UCG through the medium of Irish and English, and indeed Commandant Seamus Burke taught Irish classes around the Nail area. Now, the village of Tourmakeady was the location of Cltme Connacht, founded in 1905. The Irish College at Tourmakeady exposed the Irish-speaking population of the region to leading players of the Irish Revival movement and Irish republicanism at this juncture. People like Pádraig and Willie Pearce, Thomas Clark, Eamon de Valera, and his then wife-to-be, Sinead Ní Lanigan, as well as Louise Gavin Duffy, among many others. The Irish College at Tourmakeady was described as the cradle of the Gaelic League in Ireland by Douglas Hyde. How these people influenced the militancy around the region is perhaps an interesting question. Equally as interesting a question is how the Sliabh Forthrigh Gaeltacht herself may have influenced the trajectory of those that taught and studied at the college, many of whom practiced their Irish with the inhabitants of the region. Now, one problem I see illustrated in the secondary literature that addresses the Tourmakeady ambush from the 1950s is the manner in which it often reduces the Srah volunteers' contribution to the periphery, particularly in the manner in which its volunteers are referred to as guides or local lads by the likes of Ernie O'Malley and Edward Gallagher. As a point of fact, these volunteers were first and foremost volunteers and comrades to the rest of the South Mayo Brigade. Irish was many of these men's first language, and Sliabh Forthrigh, Mount Parthree, or the Tourmakeady region was the centre of things to those from and off the place. From the vantage of Mount Parthree, other villages and towns outside of the district were the periphery of their everyday experiences. Notions surrounding periphery depend on which side of the metaphorical bridge one might be standing, and the fact that every military engagement that took place in South Mayo took place in the parish in question might seem to make the Tourmakeady Parthree area very centrally located with respect to South Mayo's experience of the Tan War. And by the summer of 1920, volunteers throughout County Mayo have been organised into 4 separate IRA brigade areas, South Mayo being one of them. South Mayo was headquartered at Cross, with Tom Maguire as its brigade OC and Michael O'Brien as brigade adjutant. The South Mayo IRA consisted of 4 battalions: the 1st Battalion of Cross, the 2nd Battalion of Ballinrobe, the 3rd Battalion of Claremorris, and the 4th Battalion of Ball. In turn, each battalion was made up of various companies from the respective catchment area, with the Ballinrobe Battalion, for instance, separated into companies of Ballinrobe, Clooney Castle, Robine, Parthree, Srah, Glenmask, and Hollymount. The same pattern was replicated in the 3 other battalions of Cross, Claremorris, and Ball, just as it was all around Ireland, where volunteers made up companies belonging to the various battalions of each brigade. Countrywide, Cumann and mBán were organised along similar geographic lines as their male comrades in the volunteers. In the South Mayo area, Cumann and mBán had companies at Ball, Ballinrobe, and Srah, and by 1921 were also organised around Glenmask. Cumann and mBán supplied a vital network of support to the volunteers' activities, notably in the provision of safe houses and the accumulation of intelligence, no less than the delivery of dispatches and the preparation and distribution of food. Additionally, they were to provide critical treatment for their IRA comrades when wounded. The success or otherwise of the volunteers' endeavours, however, still largely hung on the support received from the local civilian population, a population from which members of the Cltme.ie and the IRA largely sprung themselves. Now, unfortunately, I can't work these slides, but South Mayo's Active Service Unit, ASU, or Flying Column, was formed at the beginning of January of 1921. It would be shortly after the Parthree ambush, later that March, however, that the same Flying Column would be consolidated into a unit of some 25 men. that were to play such a prominent part in the events of May the 3rd. Headquartered at the home house of Lieutenant Michael Moran of Kildun, the flying column did most of its training on Moran's land. Audie Morans also possessed an invaluable lookout post which offered a clear vantage of the surrounding countryside while the flying column went through its various drills. Along with Republican families like the Morans and the O'Hares, Kildun was likewise the home to Brigade Adjutant Michael O'Brien, as well as OC of the Cross Battalion, Commandant Seamus Sonny Burke. During the period between the Partry and the Tourmakeady ambushes, Kildun Republicans like Katie O'Brien and her cousin Mary Moran took charge of feeding the column, a task which included baking some 19 loaves of bread each day. No less than the flying column's training regime around Kildun, however, every company throughout South Mayo had to go through their own drilling exercises, doing so in similarly secluded landscapes. Now, as already highlighted, all of the military action that took place in South Mayo during the War of Independence took place in the parish of Ballyovi, a parish that possessed one church at Partry and another at Tourmakeady. By 1921, Ballyovi was another notable centre of Republican activity in Mayo, with 86 members attached to the Srah Company, 64 members to the Partry Company, and a further 44 strong membership belonging to the Glen Mask. At the same juncture, Commemorative at Srah under its OC, Margaret Donoghue, likewise possessed a formidable presence with over 40 women on its membership roll. The Srah volunteers did much of their drilling at the Mockery, Drumcoggy and Tourmakeady Hill. The Srah volunteers' familiarity with Tourmakeady likely proved critical in the skirmish that took place there after the Tourmakeady ambush of May the 3rd. Furthermore, the area was commonage for families around Durrassa, Tourmakeady, as well as Srah itself, and had been since time out of mind. These volunteers had a generational understanding of this patch of land that their families had used for centuries, a factor which surely stood to them and their comrades from outside the region in the heat of combat in what turned out. The Sunday of February the 20th, however, proved a different story when those gathered for drilling exercises were suddenly surrounded by the British Army and other Crown forces. The following Saturday, the Connacht Telegraph reported how, having got information that the volunteers were in the habit of drilling in a secluded valley, practically surrounded by trees, soldiers and police from Galway, Ballinrobe and Castlebar, with machine guns mounted, managed to capture some 37 men. The captured Partry men were then taken to Ballinrobe and soon after imprisoned in Galway. Whether or not any shot had been fired at this event, the Partry volunteers captured that Sunday afternoon might provide us with the opening salvo of the Tan War in South Mayo. A fortnight later, the Partry men's fellow parishioners from the Srah Company, along with their near neighbours from the Ballyglass Company, were to return fire on the British Army at the very scene of their comrades' recent capture, Kilfall. Indeed, the very choice of Kilfall as to the location of the volunteers' first military engagement in the area might be said to have been a rather daring statement of intent in and of itself. Time is against me here, but with respect to the Partry ambush, sometimes referred to as the Kilfall ambush, as well as the Port Royal ambush, the military engagement in question has been noted as the first such engagement between Irish and British forces in Mayo since 1798. But very briefly, however, apart from volunteers attached to the Srah and Ballyglass companies, there were about 6 others present at the place of the ambush, which included OC of the operation Tom Maguire and Adjutant Michael O'Brien. The group on the east side of the road consisted of about 21 Srah men and was headed by O'Brien, while Maguire was in charge of a similar amount of the Ballyglass volunteers on the other side of the narrow road, where they were waiting to ambush a convoy of what was believed to have been 2 vehicles of British Army. As it transpired, only 1 vehicle landed. Now, a number of the British party escaped from the vehicle that was fired on and managed to retreat up the road. These included the then leading officer of the C Company of the Border Regiment at Ballinrobe, Captain Herbert Chatfield, and Lieutenant George Craig, as well as a number of other troops, some of whom were also wounded. Chatfield was shot in the knee and was still out of action 2 months later when the same company of the British Army from Ballinrobe would again engage with the Srah men and the South Mayo Brigade at Tourmakeady Hill, whereas Lieutenant George Craig would again see combat against many of the same men in the engagement that was to follow a few months later. There were 2 seriously wounded British soldiers left at the convoy, Corporal Charles Bell and Private William Wardle. Anthony Joyce of Tourmakeady related how Michael O'Brien and Tom Lally ordered us to hold our fire because some of the English soldiers were wounded and no Tans had been present. The wounded men requested a priest of O'Brien and Lally, telling them that they were each Catholics and wished to receive the last rites. Mick O'Brien continued to apply first aid to the men, while Tom Lally set off to the parochial house at Partry to fetch Father Thomas O'Malley. Father O'Malley subsequently travelled to the scene of the ambush by horse and cart and made it to the scene of the vehicle, where he anointed both men, and then brought the 2 wounded Englishmen back with him by means of his horse and cart to the parochial house at Partry. Corporal Charles Bell was later to die in the county infirmary at Castlebar. A few hours after the engagement at Kilfall, a lorry load of Crown forces made their way to Srah. Thomas Horn, who had previously written his letter of complaint to the Ballinrobe RIC concerning the behaviour of Crown forces that had stolen his goose and killed other fowl on his farm, had been warming himself by the fire when summarily shot by an occupant of the lorry parked outside his home. A couple of hours after the shooting of Thomas Horn, Father Heaney arrived to find that the deceased was lying unconscious on the floor, all blood and his brains protruding from his forehead. Mr. Horn lasted a few hours after the shooting, in which time both Father Heaney and Father Murphy had arrived with holy oils to anoint him. Now Mr. Horn's daughter was with them when the Crown forces that killed him entered the family kitchen that day. Months later, Mary Horn was to describe in a Ballinrobe courthouse how her father had been sitting by the fire when the men entered their family home. "Good day, sir," they saluted him 3 times. She then described how after he had replied to them a 3rd time, one of the men shot him and he fell into the fire. The Connacht Telegraph went on to report how Mary Horn then pulled him out without assistance, the men looking on and saw that his brains were out through his head. The men went out after a while and joined their comrades in a lorry outside and drove off. And when Mary Horn pulled her father out of her family's hearth, with Crown forces, amongst them his killer, watching on, it is hard to fathom how the same body of forces driving away from Srah that evening might ever be seen as having any standing or legitimacy in that area again. The implications of the death of Thomas Horn for the standing and legitimacy of Crown forces in the region cannot be underestimated. The shockwaves that his death caused was heard as far away as Westminster Parliament, but his cold-blooded killing was also certainly to the forefront of Mayo people's minds in the intervening 2 months leading up to the Tourmakeady Ambush, not least of whom volunteers attached to Srah. 2 months after Mr. Horn's killing, the South Mayo column met at Durrawar Bridge, where they were then led in through the village of Srah on the Saturday before the Tourmakeady Ambush by Srah volunteers. The first house they passed as they made their way up Srah Hill was that which once belonged to the late Thomas Horn. Now, most of the intervening 2 months between the ambushes at Partry and Tourmakeady, March the 7th to March the 3rd, was spent in the vicinity of Mourns in Kildun for a large portion of the Flying Column's members. Shortly after the Partry ambush, however, Tom Lally became OC of the Ballinrobe Battalion. Lally and Pat Gibbons Tady from Coggy were members of the Flying Column, as was Michael Costello of Tourmakeady. At this juncture, the Ballinrobe Battalion's headquarters likewise moved from Ballinrobe to Srah. The 3 Srah men that left Audie Mourns for their native Sliabh Forthree that early April would have a busy and no doubt stressful month ahead of them. By the end of April, many of the rest of the members of the Flying Column based at Mourns began making shapes to join them at Srah. But 2 days before departing his native Kildun for Mount Partry, the brigade adjutant, Michael O'Brien, wrote the following home truths to IRA GHQ in Dublin in a letter dated April the 28th, 1921. Everywhere the companies are working well and the men are eager to get going. In addition, a flying column of 25 has been formed of men I believe as good as any in Ireland. But we have absolutely no stuff. GHQ never gave us anything but 5 Mauser rifles and 50 rounds in all, and 100 rounds of revolver ammunition. For these rifles, there are only a few rounds left for each. When that is expended, they are useless to us. If you can't send stuff, we would send them back. We have little shotgun ammunition. Since last November, a sum of £300 has been deposited to our credit at GHQ, for which we have got nothing to speak of. Under the circumstances, how can GHQ expect big results here? Now, some of the 5 Mauser rifles for which the South Mayo Brigade had only a few rounds left were likely sent to the region by Richard Walsh from England, member of the National Executive, as well as acting liaison between Mayo and GHQ in Dublin. Dick Walsh was again in England in May of 1921 when he procured a more substantial cache of arms, some of which soon after made its way back to South Mayo, but not in time for the ambush. Now, Kilmaine native Lieutenant James O'Brien's copy of the photograph of the flying column captures what appears to be an impressively armed body of men. The image was taken after the truce, however. Mayo was often described as coming late to the Tan War. A large reason for this was the inability to get arms back to those on the front line. Now, the most obvious night for the column to travel into Srah might seem to have been either on the Sunday or Monday night, May the 1st or May the 2nd, before the ambush. However, at the time, Crown forces patrolled the district on Sundays and Mondays and had done so since the engagement at Kilfall, which itself had taken place on a Monday. Monday was also market day in Ballinrobe, and the column would have been easily spotted by the crowds either coming or leaving the town that day. Tourmakeady native James Goulding astutely points out that the choice of Tourmakeady village as to the location of the ambush was no coincidence and largely reflected the village's religious makeup at the time. It was, as Goulding points out, an overwhelmingly Protestant village and by extension loyalist in its sympathies, which perhaps minimised the potential threat of reprisals taking place for its residents in the aftermath of an ambush. Liam Alex Heffron's inaugural and thought-provoking presentation for this series of talks points out that volunteers tended not to want an ambush in their own vicinity. The threat of reprisals hung over the Tan War like a spectre. Jack Murphy of Cong describes how in early 1921, a particular spot that General Maguire had selected for an ambush to take place in Cong village, near the OC's native cross was, and I quote, a perfect position because Maguire and his men would have both flanks protected by dry canal, end quote. Nevertheless, when the parish priest landed on the scene, persuaded him to call off the attack on account of the danger for Cong being burned down as a reprisal. It may have been, as Murphy pointed out, quote, with great reluctance that General Maguire abandoned his adventurous position. Nevertheless, nobody wanted reprisals on their own doorstep. Now, Tom Maguire's first report sent to Dick Mulcahy concerning the events of May the 3rd illustrate that 42 of the 60 participants of the ambush at Tourmakeady belonged to the Ballinrobe Battalion. The moving of the Ballinrobe Battalion's headquarters from Ballinrobe town to Srah a month before the ambush at Tourmakeady brought with it distinct advantages that likely proved critical in the planning as well as eventual implementation of the engagement of May the 3rd. Firstly, local knowledge and reconnaissance proved essential. Additionally, the practicalities arising from the move of the battalion's headquarters to Srah must have certainly eased the logistics involved in volunteers and Cumann of the area, arranging the accommodation of so many volunteers from outside the area on the nights before the ambush. The leading officers of the Ballinrobe Battalion at Srah, as well as Margaret Donoghue and her officers in the region, had the task of providing a significant number of outsiders to safely be dispersed and housed throughout one locality prior to a military engagement, which reflects a considerable level of support for the volunteers' endeavours in the Srah region. That being said, very few of the volunteers or Cltme members knew where volunteers from outside the area were to be housed. Srah, as the organisational hub of the Ballinrobe Battalion, enabled a limited number of volunteers and Cltme to more easily and securely distribute those IRA men coming from outside the region into what was a tightly knit network of local safe houses from which the Srah company itself had largely sprung. Now, on the morning of the ambush, shortly after the column had landed in the village of Tourmakeady that morning, residents and staff at Hewitt's Hotel, such as Dr. Edward Murphy and his wife, Josephine, along with occupants of the post office, were moved by volunteers to an empty house belonging to Tim Robinson, where they were to remain until sometime about 2 p.m. that afternoon. Dr. Murphy was considered attached to the Srah Company and the Ballinrobe Company and the South Mayo Brigade, and would be brought up to the Rasa the following day by Srah Cumann to treat the injured Tom Maguire's wounds. The column gathered at the fairgreen at about 8 a.m. when Mick O'Brien gave each man his ration of food. This was the last morsel many would taste until 11 o'clock that night. The OC Tom Maguire soon after moved with a unit of volunteers to an area around the post office. Most of Tom Maguire's contingent at the post office seemed to have been from Cross. The group of volunteers under Tom Maguire were to join up with 3 sections that were waiting to ambush an expectant convoy of RAC and TANs, depending on how the ambush transpired. As it transpired, Tom Maguire and a number of his men joined up with a section of men based at Drumbawn Gate after the shooting commenced. In relation to the 3 sections, Tom Maguire relayed in his first report of the ambush, dated May the 16th, 1921, sent to Dick Mulcahy at GHQ, how, quote, I got the men into their positions, 3 in number, as I expected 3 cars in a patrol. A distance of about 200 yards separated each of my ambush parties. Adjutant of the Srah Company, Sean Hanahan, similarly described how the volunteers were expecting 3 vehicles that day and were waiting in 3 separate sections. Sean Heenan describes the 3 sections as being positioned at Drumbawn, Hewitt's Hotel, and above the fairgreen. Or in his own words, the barrack here I Borcandura agus Hagach gáchar siar lena bóthraí chuile cheachtain. Dénis muid é sin den na hifigi a bhí os ar gionn agus dúirt sí linn fis cén tám nó cén lá a hagadís. Dénis muid sin dómh agus crinne muid. Crinne siad sús agus thuaim muid siar go Tourmakeady. Bhí muid ag súla 3 char agus bhí muid festile le haid 3 char. Ceannach Drumbawn agus ceannach teachtós the Hewitt agus ceannos ceann Trothaidonine. The section at the fairgreen was led by Michael O'Brien, the section at the junction beside Hewitt's led by Tom Lally, and the section at Drumbawn Gate was headed by Kilkerran native Captain Paddy May. There were 3 sections. The secondary literature dating from 1948 only referred to 2 of the 3 leaders of these sections. There was a 3rd man missing from the narrative. Now, all of the Srah and Glenmass contingent seemed to have been either posted at Michael O'Brien's position above the fairgreen or at Tom Lally's near Hewitt's Hotel. Kildun native Mick O'Brien had had prior experience of military action alongside Srah volunteers at the Partry Ambush, when 21 members of the Srah Company were stationed at the east side of the road under Michael O'Brien's leadership during the Partry Ambush the previous March. According to John Colleran, the section of men at Drumbawn Gate under Captain Paddy May all came from Captain May's own Ballinrobe area, with the sole exception of Houndswood native Michael Shaughnessy, who belonged to the Cross Company. There were 12 men placed at the Drumbawn section. But Tom Maguire's first report, dated May the 16th, stated that he picked 3 men for the 3 sections at the ambush. The subsequent exclusion of Srah volunteers from taking any leadership role at the ambush in so much of the secondary literature written about the event needs to be addressed and given some context. There would not nor could not have been an ambush in Tourmakeady were it not for the strength of the Srah volunteers and the level of support they received from their own community. Secondary accounts of the ambush and subsequent skirmish, however, from the late 1940s until the publication of my late father's book in 2008, do not mention Commandant Tom Lally. Following the subsequent death of Michael O'Brien and the incapacitation of OC Tom Maguire later that afternoon, the injured Tom Maguire ordered Tom Lally to take over command of the column. According to Lieutenant James O'Brien of Kilmaine, Tom Lally was still in charge of the flying column when its photograph was taken after the truce later that summer. The still injured OC of the brigade, Tom Maguire, likewise appears in the photo, and a poignant gap was left open in the photograph in honour of Brigade Adjutant Michael O'Brien, who died on Tourmakeady Hill the previous May. The fact that Tom Lally's name was continuously excluded from secondary accounts concerning engagements that took place in his own parish during the Tan War might seem to have been deemed justifiable on account of him leaving the irregular or anti-treaty side and bringing others with him at a critical period in the Civil War. Now, unlike West Mayo and North Mayo, the military engagements remained on a limited scale in the South Mayo region throughout the Civil War, regardless of whether most of the volunteers held an anti-treaty viewpoint, which they did. There were 4 members of the convoy that travelled through Tourmakeady killed that afternoon: Herbert Oakes, Patrick O'Regan, William Power, and John Regan. The first to arrive in Tourmakeady after the ambush were the RIC. The unfortunate and no doubt distraught spouses of the deceased and injured had been brought to the village in one of these vehicles shortly after the ambush. The traumatic events took a heavy toll on these men's families, as fatalities caused by Crown forces took a similarly equal toll on families in South Mayo region. Recent scholarship by Eve Morrison shines a light on RIC experiences during the Anglo-Irish War and offers us a broader understanding of both sides' experiences during those troubled times. Well, the RIC that travelled to Tourmakeady after the ambush from Ballinrobe apprehended Pádraig Feeney, would set off from Ballinrobe to Tourmakeady, with similar news to that which had been brought to the volunteers by Patrick Varley. Young Pádraig Feeney was questioned at Dewar's Hotel by Crown forces. He was later shot dead by an unnamed Englishman at about 3:15 p.m. near the Rectory Gate. A monument was later erected near the site of the teenager's killing. The Tans would later raid and damage his grieving family's home at Ballinrobe. Now, at a certain juncture, Crown forces made their way into Dewar's Hotel, where they remained ensconced until the volunteers left the village and firing had come to a halt. The volunteers that escaped into the hills had taken part in what they understood to be a standalone ambush. They were ill-equipped for any other military engagements, as their ammunition was all but spent. The telephone wires at Tourmakeady post office unfortunately had not been securely disconnected by the IRA stationed there, however, which subsequently enabled requests for military assistance to be communicated soon after the volunteers had left the village. Word soon got through to the post office at Ballinrobe, and soon after the C Company of the Border Regiment were preparing to make their way to Tourmakeady. The B Company of the same Border Regiment based in Castlebar were very soon to receive word of the same events from Ballinrobe at around 2:15 p.m. A description of the military that travelled to the region from Ballinrobe was given by Lieutenant Geoffrey Iverson as follows. Quote, "The strength of the party under my command was 3 officers, including myself, and 36 ORs, other ranks." Now, if the by then retired Major Geoffrey Iverson is correct here, then the vehicles that travelled from Ballinrobe consisted of 2 Crossleys of military troops that landed in Tourmakeady village at about 3 o'clock, as well as a 3-ton truck of troops under the command of Lieutenant George Craig that arrived at Srah sometime around 3:30. Each vehicle contained 3 parties of British soldiers under the commands of the then Lieutenant Geoffrey Iverson, Lieutenant C.W. Smith, and Lieutenant George Craig. Iverson commanded a party of 8 other troops, Smith commanded a party consisting of a further 8 troops, and Craig commanded a party consisting of some 20 troops apart from himself. Now, judging by a previously unpublished British Army source that would be engaged in the upcoming edition of the book, when Smith and Iverson arrived at Tourmakeady, they were told by the RIC that the IRA had escaped into the hills. The same British source then indicates that the party of troops under Smith and the party of soldiers under Iverson left Tourmakeady village, with Smith's party heading in a southerly direction and Iverson's group travelling into the hills in a northerly direction. Iverson's party was following a similar path that the volunteers had previously taken out of the village. Smith's party, however, headed south and would later capture two Glenmask volunteers, Paddy King and Philip Hallinan. Both men would be subsequently incarcerated in Galway, but were eventually released, and indeed Paddy King appears in the photo of the flying column taken after the truce in the far left position of its second row. Meanwhile, British sources indicate that some 6 vehicles of trucks and lorries likewise made their way to the region from the B Company of the Border Regiment at Castlebar. RIC and TANs from Westport in an undetermined number of vehicles seem likewise to have also travelled to the area in the ambush's aftermath. Whether or not other Crown forces came to the Srah and Tourmakeady region the same day, however, remains a matter of conjecture and continued dispute. Now, there were only 2 witness statements submitted to the military archives concerning the events of May the 3rd, one of which was submitted by James Goulding, the son of the former RIC sergeant at Tourmakeady. The only other statement submitted to the military archives is that given by Geoffrey Iverson, who was the leading officer to travel to Tourmakeady from Ballinrobe on the day in question. Iverson's witness statement to the military archives was therefore the only previously published account given by a British soldier in relation to May the 3rd. There were, however, other accounts made by members of the British Army that were sent to the Tourmakeady and Srah that day, accounts that will also receive attention in the forthcoming publication. Now, the witness statement made by Geoffrey Iverson to the military archives contains erroneous statements that had no basis in what happened. Firstly, the central tenet of his witness statement sent to the Military Bureau in December of 1955 argued that most of the British soldiers who travelled to the area after the ambush were somehow under orders to leave the region so as to return to Castlebar by 7 p.m. in preparation for a drive that was to take place the next morning in neighbouring County Galway. The supposed return of the B Company troops to their Castlebar base by 7 p.m. that evening was, Iverson argued, the main reason why British forces proved unable to account for or defeat the IRA men that possessed so little ammunition during the skirmish on Tournakeady Hill. In reality, however, the British Army that travelled to the region from Castlebar had remained in the area until late that night and did not leave the district to take part in the drive in mBán the following morning, as Iverson's statement to the military archives stated. A fact Iverson himself privately conceded sometime after his statement to the military archives was submitted. There are, however, a plethora of other inaccuracies offered by Geoffrey Iverson in his account in the military archives that do not stand up to any scrutiny. His statement to the military archives is a decidedly compromised document that had been proofread and edited by historian of the Border Regiment, Major Philip James Shears, before its submission to the Military Bureau. By about 4 p.m, an exchange of gunfire had begun to take place between a body of British troops, which included Lieutenant Craig, and the Mayo men on the mountain. This group of British soldiers had ascended the hills from Srah, where the truck they travelled from Ballinrobe was parked. This unit of troops positioned themselves just below where the group of some 30 IRA men had been resting in the aftermath of the earlier ambush at Tourmakeady. During this exchange of fire, Tom Maguire was first shot and seriously injured. While this exchange was taking place, however, another group of 9 British Army men, led by Geoffrey Iverson, had been in pursuit of 4 volunteers, all of whom seemed to have been natives of Seangarth. In the course of this pursuit, Geoffrey Iverson seems to have left his own party of 8 other troops behind him and made his way up around the group of IRA men that had been under sustained fire from the party of British troops positioned below the volunteers. Iverson then found himself above a cluster of about 10 volunteers that included the by then injured Tom Maguire, lying on the ground. The same group also included Mick O'Brien, Michael O'Malley, Michael Shaughnessy, Seamus Burke, and James O'Brien, among others. When the red-haired Geoffrey Ibbotson, who had by then discarded his army jacket, made it up towards these volunteers, the Mayo men mistook him for the similarly red-haired local volunteer and member of the Flying Column, Michael Costello of Tourmakeady. Michael O'Brien had been administering first aid to the injured Tom Maguire when Ibbotson approached this group from behind, that is to say, from above its position. Ibbotson soon after shot at but missed Michael O'Malley. And that bit of information is taken from Michael O'Malley himself and indeed Ibbotson. In as far as Ibbotson, in a later account, maintains that he shot at a volunteer that was standing very close to where Tom Maguire was lying down, and Michael O'Brien was giving him first aid. After which he then shot, and after this he shot Michael O'Brien dead. While Michael O'Brien was giving first aid to his injured OC, he reached for his rifle when Ibbotson began to shoot. Now, Michael O'Brien's rifle jammed, but immediately after Ibbotson shot Michael O'Brien, other IRA men in the same vicinity began firing at Ibbotson. Cltme native James O'Brien shot him twice. Ibbotson was also shot by Michael Shaughnessy. In all, it seems Geoffrey Ibbotson received some 7 bullet wounds while racing for his life through the volunteers. Now, according to another British Army source, as Ibbotson attempted to escape for his life down the hills, he tried to communicate something to the party of British soldiers positioned below the volunteers that had been firing at the Irish party, while Ibbotson was trying to flee the scene. Whatever it was that Ibbotson shouted to his British comrades, whatever he said was drowned out by the sound of machine gun, grenade and rifle fire. Yorkshire native Ibbotson somehow managed to escape down the mountain, eventually reaching a truck that had evidently brought the troops under Lieutenant George Craig to Srah. But yet another British source indicates that news was then sent back to the authorities at Tourmakeady as to the whereabouts of the IRA on the hill, as well as the whereabouts of the British combatants that were engaged in them. Geoffrey Ibbotson was then brought back to Ballinrobe, where he received treatment for his injuries. And most of the Flying Column, about 18 men from the Cross area, were up on Tourmakeady Hill at this juncture, as was Flying Column members Tom Lally of Srah and Pat Gibbons Tady of Tourmakeady. From the Ballinrobe region, Terry O'Brien and La Valley native Michael O'Malley was likewise up on the hill. Other members of the Srah Company, however, up on Tourmakeady Hill included its adjutant Sean Fadhian, Lieutenant Tom Lally of Shongirth and Thomas Costello, among others. But prior to the arrival of the British Army, many local volunteers had been only recently sent home. Some of these numbers subsequently returned up Tourmakeady on becoming aware of the growing presence of British soldiers in the area, which include Anthony Joyce of Tourmakeady, Martin Conway, Gert Buncullen, and young Tommy Lally of Towna. Sometime after 4 p.m, Mick O'Brien was dead and the OC Tom Maguire was incapacitated. The IRA had little ammunition left, were hungry and thirsty on what was an unusually hot day, and yet somehow they managed to survive sustained rifle and machine gun fire over the space of the next 6 hours before night fell. A distance of some 100 yards was said by one British Army source to have separated the Mayo men from their British Army opponents for most of the duration of the military engagement. By the time Crown forces left their position at 10:30 p.m. that night, the volunteers were covered in turf mould from the machine gun and rifle fire that had cut up the heather surrounding them. Now, that's the end. That's as far as I've got now. That there's
Thanks very much, Ultan. That was a lot of information given there, a lot to mull over.
Okay. So we're still on record, and can take any questions. Ultan, maybe just a question about your the book that you're publishing very soon. You've got quite a lot of new material in there. Must have taken a lot of research and digging around.
Just over the years, I mean, Dad was getting sick. We put it on the long finger, and then we get another burst of energy, and something else would come in, and something else would come in. But there is one. I think I mentioned it to you, Tomas. There's one account, and it's a British source that suggests that the Pocock was the RSC man that was based in Tourmakeady. Now, there was a plainclothes British intelligence man there, and he, according to the British Army man, he seemed to have been running the show, and he knew where all of the British forces were at that time, and he had a knowledge of Irish. Now, the same man, he seems to have been English. The same man, what was it? I've lost my oh yeah, the intelligence officers in the South Mayo area were, that I know of, were two Smiths that were based in Claremorris, and they were neither of those two. But I don't know who it was. It could have possibly been Peckingham, who was over the Castlebar barracks at the time. But he remains a mystery, that man. But
and is there any things written material from him or that about the IRA?
Sorry, well, there is something that I got that Ibbotson wrote. He said that the two officers from Castlebar really let him down. And one of them was I think it was Woods, or this is the man that is mentioned in, I should have this off the top of my head, in his account to the military archives. But his superior officer was Peckingham, and he said both those men, I've always sensed that both these men let me down that day. So that was his take on it. Now, whether it was Peckingham or not, I don't know. But it seemed to be the fact that he had a knowledge of Irish and he was an intelligence officer, and I don't know how good his Irish was, but it's an English soldier that's saying this.
Mm.
Sorry, Ultan, just one final question. When Ibbotson was shot and he made his escape, it appeared that the fight went out of the British regiment. And do you think that because their leader was gone, that they didn't seem to have the same gusto for the battle, or is there any evidence of that effect?
My sense of that is that, I mean, one British source said that there were 100 yards. 100 yards isn't all that far. Now, according to Ibbotson, they were down below. There were was it 600 yards? Was one claim that he made, but as they saw Ibbotson running down like the hammers of hell, and him having been shot. Now, he was very lucky to have survived that, and it was a pure freak, really, that he survived. And according to Sean Faddy, one of the bullets that hit him hit his bandolier that was over his, and only for that he would have been gone. It was after Jeffrey Ibbotson left. It was intervals of 15 minutes that they'd start shooting, but they never advanced from that 100 yards after that. I suppose the psychologically, and also that terrain is pretty boggy. Now, I know don't compromise. And I know it was a very hot day, but it doesn't matter. You'd want to know that place to be running around it, you know. That,
yeah, but it's amazing that that the British didn't advance on the IRA position because of the limited weapons they had and ammunition.
but they
wouldn't have been able to hold out for too long.
Oh no, they wouldn't. But they didn't know that. I don't think they knew that. Now, Tom Lally of Shongert maintains because they were spread out so much that the English were afraid. They thought there was a lot more of them up there. That's what he thought that they thought. There actually wasn't. Now, whether the question is whether the Castlebar contingent was up there or not, there's no reason in the world for them not to have been up there, because they landed when they landed in Tourmakeady village, according to themselves, according to the leading officer from Castlebar, the RIC, the remains of the RIC men were still there. So it was early in the day, you know. Now, one account has them out way off up in their park or somewhere like that, but that's only one account, and that's only a lot of it would have been, I think myself, a lot of it was tied up to those MBEs that both Lieutenant George Craig and Iverson got for their performance up there. But in many respects, the British performance up on Third of Oath was a disaster. Now I know it was obviously a disaster for the volunteers that Michael O'Brien and Tom Maguire was so seriously injured, but they didn't really account themselves for so much all that well, because all of those men were well stocked up with ammunition before they left. The other thing is that if you notice, even his own account, they were sitting in the messer's chair before, when they got word of the ambush, as in they had their lunch. They were all well fed. The volunteers up on the hill, they had their last bit to eat at around 8 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah,
and most of them didn't eat until 11 o'clock that night. They must have been starving, and they must have been thirsty as well.
Do we know, Ultan, where the location of the Lewis gun was shooting into Tourmakeady Hill?
Well, according to one source, it would have been right below where volunteers were stationed, and that source would be a British source, like it had come from George Craig. Now, whether there was one or two, I suspect there was probably only one going on Sean Faddy's account. But Sean Faddy's account, his impression was that there were, he said, he used the word Bajer, but he said hundreds of them. Now, whether there was hundreds or not, there seemed to have been, there could have been an awful lot more, but it's all conjecture. I mean, people just don't know, you know. The volunteers that were up there, they were covered in turf mold when they came down. There was rifles, grenades.
And Sean Paddy doesn't mention where.
Excuse me?
Sean Paddy doesn't mention where the Lewis gun was stationed.
No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't.
And Ultan, wasn't the RAF reputed to be combing over the area?
Oh, they were definitely over the area. No, whether you want to, whether anybody believes what Tom Lally said, but my grandfather always said he was up in a field. He was up in a field with Tom Maguire afterwards, and his anecdote was that they were hovering over non-stop, and he went running zigzag so they wouldn't spot Tom Maguire. But the other thing is that when that drive was sent that time to the Mam Turks, they asked for ammunition with the or for them to be fully loaded. the planes. No, my own sense is that that drive in Mam Turk was a red herring, anyways. That was, I mean, the drive to the Mam Turks happened because of the Tourmakeady ambush. Now, if you look at the British reports, they were saying it was. There seemed to be a kind of a sense that it was going to happen anyways. It wasn't. I don't think it doesn't make any sense.
One possible interpretation of that is that the drive was going to be more in the East Galway area, and that the Tourmakeady ambush changed the route of the drive altogether. That's the only possible sort of combination of explanations of the accounts.
Yeah, but I think even the accounts of the Times, if you look at the Times, the Irish Times and the papers afterwards, the impression that they gave is that the drive was there to catch the volunteers that they suspected were heading over to the Man Turks. That's the sense I get from the papers. Now, subsequently, if you read the British Eugene's papers, he tweaks it a little bit, but I'm not so sure. Well, maybe there would have been a drive in East Galway, but essentially the point remains the drive became a drive to catch the volunteers that took part in the Tourmakeady ambush.
Is in the escape of in the aftermath, I have not come across anywhere, I haven't read anything about how well scouted the landscape was, and how did they end up in Mayo Abbey? Was that sort of well planned, or how did some of them go one direction, some of them go another direction? And the landscape and the shape and the contours of the topography of Tourmakeady and all these places. I've heard, we've had these discussions like among this group that it's deceiving from, if you're down in Srah and you look up, that if you're up there, you can find massive amounts of hills and hollows and dikes and rivers and streams and places to hide and places to move that no one would know you're there. But I'm just wondering, was that a pre-scouted thing, or was that just they scattered and made a run for it and took a risk on where they could best break the lines? Because I'm sure they anticipated Castlebar and Westport would be sending reinforcements, and they were better to cut through the obvious line than go up in front of them and have them catch up to them anyway.
I'd say they weren't expecting the reinforcement. They thought they had the telephone wires cut. So I don't think they expected a skirmish. They were hoping to make their escape.
But like, I mean, the attempt was made to cut the lines.
Yeah.
Because I think they claimed money for the lines, but I mean, the reality is that somehow the line wasn't cut right. Now, they were no way equipped for anything but a standalone ambush.
Yeah.
In all fairness, South Mayo was badly equipped with weapons. I mean, those men, most of them only had shotguns, and as Michael O'Brien put it himself, they didn't even have ammunition for the shotguns. So I mean, the ambush itself, it was, from a military point of view, was a success, but they had to get out of Dodge very, very quickly. When they left, initially they were resting up and I think that's something that James Heenan mentions, that they were all safe, and why were we sent home? Because when they were sent home, they were sent down, and as they were going down, they were met with the British soldiers coming up. They didn't have much chance at all, And those 4 men from Shangert, I mean, they all had shotguns. And as well, they were trying to dump guns. Now, subsequently, there was two consignments of guns caught or found the next day. One of them would have been the group of guns that were left beside Michael O'Brien, but there was also another catchment of guns that were trying to hide, but as they were trying to hide, the British soldiers were coming up and caught them. And those lads were very lucky. Those 4 men were very lucky to get away with their lives, because the men that were coming after them were fully equipped with bandoliers and rifles, but again, I think those 4 men from Shongert knew their terrain. And I think the Srah volunteers had a decided advantage up on that hill in that respect. Now, for one thing, you don't hear of any of them. They weren't in a group like, say, Michael O'Brien, Tom McGuire, and say all those officers. They probably would have, because they knew the terrain, they were probably just instinctively they would have known not to kind of congregate. I think that's just my sense. It's not probably doesn't make any sense, but
chances are most of the shots that Eberson suffered were probably buckshot from shotguns, because if he was hit with that many bullets, he wouldn't.
No, well, that's true.
Just bits and pieces of few grains he got here and a few grains he got there, enough to draw a bit of blood out of him and weaken him. But if he was hit with bullets, is it 5 times you said?
Well,
7.
according to themselves, 7 times. But you see, the thing with Iberson is that at the time, maybe a year later, they were letting people go on what they called, it was a sort of the British Army was downsizing big time at the time, and anyone that was superfluous, anyone that was anyway injured was retired. Lieutenant Smith was forcibly retired, and Craig was forcibly retired. But Iberson, who in the Ballinrobe courthouse maintained, and doctors maintained for him, that his career was over, he had a great career in the British Army subsequently. So that aspect doesn't make much sense, right?
Just a final question, Ultan. When do you think your book is due to come out?
Well, I have a conference this month, next month, on a more 17th century period, and I have 2 footnotes to sort out in the book that I need the archives, particular archives, to get into. All the archives, as you know, it's very hard to get into them. The military archives, you can't get into them, any of them. It's been a disaster in that front. But the book itself, the epilogue was, I say, well, finished about the last few weeks before Dad died. There's not much. Well, there's little bits like what Michael Linsky pointed out to me about his granddad, but that has to be changed. But other than that, well, please God, now maybe August.